Hare Namaha. Aside from its institutional absurdity, a previously bona fide and powerful branch of the Hare Kṛṣṇa movement of the Gaudiya Sampradaya was converted into a hypocritical illusion full of pretension, conflict, and maleficence in the spring of 1978. The conversion was for the benefit of 11 men and their sycophants. Those 11, who took de facto control of the institution's wavering governing body, captured the movement. Each prince imitated a Mahabhagavat, and they divided the world into 11 principalities as their individual jurisdictions. These were called Guru zones, and the princes became known as Zonal Acharyas. In that devolving process, they became self-appointed so-called spiritual masters, heralding themselves as successors to His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupāda. He had departed physical manifestation just months previous to this mutiny by his leading secretaries, who had hijacked the movement, imitated him, and betrayed him. During the all too brief time that he guided it, 1966 through 1977, although the last year, 1977, he did not have much influence, Prabhupada, the founder ācārya of that branch of this Chaitanya movement, had empowered it to become the most influential international representation of the disciplic succession in Vaishnava history. Our podcast is going to focus upon the dissolution of that Zonal Acharya scam during the 8 years that it was operative. It is going to discuss how the conversion of Prabhupada's organization invalidated the movement, how it converted that international organization into the fabricated so-called ISKCON confederation, and how all of its bogus gurus created only improperly initiated disciples. This audio podcast will concisely analyze the negative ramifications and repercussions of the hijackers, the leading secretaries who engineered the movement's takeover via vitiated governing body imprimatur in the spring of 1978. However, all of this will be summarized and discussed rather briefly. Near its end, the chief point of this month's podcast will be to communicate the reasons of how and why the zonals cratered in less than a decade. Materially speaking, there was no obvious or tangible reason why they should have done so. Nevertheless, that debacle did do so. What did and does that mean, both then and now? Is there a silver lining to its fall? Even though the zonal deviation was replaced in the mid-80s by but another transformation, is there something to glean from that epic fail, which is spiritually positive? All of this will be analyzed so that you can understand the actual narrative of the Hare Kṛṣṇa movement. As most of you know who have followed my podcast for the last half year or longer, this month's presentation is also a continuation of our multi-part series analyzing and reviewing, mostly favorably, a book by Henry Doktorski entitled 11 Naked Emperors. As always, we shall refer to the book by its acronym, In the rest of the transmission here, we shall refer to it by its acronym ENE. We have now reached Chapter 9 of ENE. The title of Chapter 9 is, quote, ISKCON Gurus Begin to Deviate, unquote. To some degree, this title is a bit misleading. There's no need to fault-find the title, but to simply mention, and Doktorski would be in full agreement with this fact, that the deviations by the unauthorized zonals began well before the events discussed in this particular chapter. Perhaps a more accurate title would have been ISKCON Gurus Begin to Deviate Egregiously. Last month, we discussed a major confrontation of the zonals in early February 1979 at Prabhupada's headquarters in Reinitiation, India. The zonals emerged from it having crushed, ruthlessly and unscrupulously, the devotees who had brought up legitimate points of contention related to Ocean's 11's gross and astral smash and grab of Prabhupada's movement. The zonals, previous to the confrontation, had control of all the centers in the world except for at Reinitiation, but they wound up finally taking over there also. This gave them a full steam of triumphalist fervor, and that overconfidence foreshadowed what would soon come to pass in their movement. It is first described in Chapter 9 of ENE. There were subsequently shocking deviations manifested amongst many of the princes, culminating in the cratering of the Zonal Acharya scam in the mid-80s. Let us now see how ENE opens Chapter 9. Quote, afflicted by pride and ambition, a few of the ISKCON gurus began falling with alarming rapidity. As early as 1980, it was no secret in ISKCON that some of the new, quote-unquote, Uttama Adhikari gurus, after hardly 2 years in business, had deviated from Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupāda's standards and teachings. Although the GBC was concerned about the erratic behavior of several of its initiating gurus, they nevertheless believed that the Diksha Guru Zonal Acharya system they had established after Prabhupada's passing was legitimate, unquote. This is, on the whole, a good entry. However, it lends itself to an inaccurate interpretation if your understanding of guru is not adequate. None of those men were gurus. In that sense, they were already fallen. The fall downs spoken of in this chapter are of the egregious category. And almost all of those fall downs are connected to ācārya, or behavior. This is referenced when ENE includes, quote-unquote, erratic behavior in that excerpt we just read. They deviated from Prabhupada's instructions more than they deviated from his teachings. Of course, by creating a sahaja arrangement, their teachings on who is and is not a spiritual master were severely flawed. The guru must be a very perfect man. None of those 11 counterfeits met the bill. However, the fall downs discussed in Chapter 9 are going to center around ācārya, or standards of behavior for bona fide gurus. We now proceed to the next excerpt from Chapter 9. Quote, the entire Zonal Acharya dispensation, however, according to some, deviated from Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's standards and teachings. First, at the March 1978 meetings, the GBC incorrectly assumed that the 11 ritvik acharyas had been appointed as Diksha Gurus by Prabhupada. Second, the GBC resolved that future Gurus could be elected by a 3/4 vote by the GBC. On March 19, 1978, the GBC resolved, quote, the GBC will consider each year at Gaura Purnim the appointment of new spiritual masters. They capitalized the S and the M of spiritual masters. What a nonsense. The GBC will consider each year at Gaura Purnim the appointment of new spiritual masters to be approved by a 3/4 vote. However, for 1978, no new spiritual masters, capitalized again, shall be appointed other than the 11 selected by Śrīla Prabhupāda, unquote. Certainly, the zonal concoction was a major deviation in and of itself. You cannot wall off gurus into zones. Any genuine guru must be both allowed and encouraged to meet his future disciple by the will of providence anywhere in the world. Zonal principalities would never be even slightly countenanced by any bona fide spiritual master. And then we come to determining guru by vote. That is completely condemned. Godbrothers do not elevate other godbrothers to the post of guru by vote. It is patent nonsense. Even at the madhyam level, the guru is determined by the shakti of his own charisma and preaching. Institutional guru means bogus guru. A guru determined by an ecclesiastical body via vote is an institutional guru. As such, if half of the vitiated GBC, at that time in the late 70s, votes to recognize one of their own as a guru, remember, this is if it's half of them, he lacks that 3/4 margin, so he cannot be guru. He didn't get the 3/4, he only got half. However, if that candidate then is able to recruit about 5 more or so of his comrades to vote in favor of him, then, with the 3/4 mandate being reached, he is voted in by the board to become a bona fide spiritual master. The whole thing is politics. The opening section of chapter 9 continues as follows, quote, some claim that a guru appointed by a 3/4 majority vote of an ecclesiastical body, in other words, an ecclesiastical guru, was condemned by Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who cited a verse by Jiva Goswami, a medieval Gaudiya Vaishnava saint, a philosopher, prolific author, and one of the 6 great followers of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, that was Jiva Goswami, of course, in this regard, and this is the quote from Jiva Goswami, it is imperative that a serious person accept a bona fide spiritual master in terms of the Shastric injunctions. Sri Jiva Goswami advises that one not accept a spiritual master in terms of hereditary or customary social and ecclesiastical conventions. One should simply try to find a genuinely qualified spiritual master for actual advancement in spiritual understanding, unquote. ISKCON was converted into so-called ISKCON when Ocean's 11 hijacked the movement in the spring of 1978, utilizing vitiated GBC imprimatur in order to carry out that mutiny. So-called ISKCON, both then and now, is the glove, and the vitiated GBC is the hand within that glove. The GBC was obviously an ecclesiastical body at that time. It thus, by a combination of its voting resolutions, which tended to change every 2 years or so, along with the big lie, that Prabhupada appointed 11 specific disciples Diksha Gurus in the summer of 1977, The GBC created institutional gurus only, or if you prefer, simply ecclesiastical gurus. However, this is condemned in that statement from Jiva Goswami. It should be clear to everyone by now that the vitiated GBC was doing its own thing, completely independent of the founder, who was allegedly its guru, as well as independent of scripture and standard Vaishnava tradition for determining guru and disciple. E then gets into the history of 3 specific zonals and their shocking activities in the aftermath of being appointed spiritual masters by the vitiated GBC. The chapter does an outstanding job of describing the egregious foibles of those 3 men, as well as giving us some background information about them. Their exploits in their zones rocked the air quotes ISKCON movement in many ways, and the movement was forced to engage in damage control. What this meant practically was that the GBC was superior to the guru or spiritual master. That was controversial for obvious reasons, especially since the 11 pretenders had established the ācārya board within the GBC during its first conclave after Prabhupada's disappearance. Establishing that board within a board was urged by Swami B.R. Sridhar, who gave the leaders of so-called ISKCON much bad advice in order to ruin Prabhupada's movement from within. And it was ruined from within and accomplished very quickly. Indeed, once the vitiated GBC recognized 11 unqualified and unauthorized men to be Zonal Acharyas and to be worshipped as Mahabhagavats, the movement was destroyed at that very moment. It no longer was a conduit for deliverance from samsara via the Guru Parampara, because it had broken its connection to the Gaudiya Vaishnava Guru Parampara. The Acharya board exacerbated all of that, obviously. It allowed the 11 men to act independently of GBC resolutions because the Acharya board was supposed to be not only independent, but higher than the rest of the GBC. However, in one sense, the GBC resolutions had no spiritual sequence, so it really didn't matter. Of course, the GBC and its loyalists, which by the late 70s and early 80s still constituted the majority of Prabhupada's initiated disciples, they thought that everything connected to GBC resolutions and mandates still mattered, and they thought that it mattered greatly. None of it mattered anymore once the major deviation went down, but the majority of devotees did not recognize this. Please note, your host speaker was not part of that majority, and I did recognize something was profoundly wrong very early on, like in the mid-70s. The Zonal Acharya imposition was the first transformation. 3 men created localized havoc via personal scandal in their zones of power after the Raman-Reti confrontation. This lit a fuse for reform. But a guru is not supposed to be subject to reform. He is supposed to be a very perfect man. As such, these scandals created a major conundrum. Although much of what then flushed out had commenced even before 1980, it was not known movement-wide. The 3 most badly behaved so-called gurus were Jayatirtha, Hansaduta, and TKG. E describes all their exploits in some detail. However, I see no need to get into any of that, or to even reproduce those excerpts. Instead, I wish, particularly later in the presentation, to pursue an in-depth analysis of deeper subjects related to the hijacking of Prabhupada's movement by the 11 imitation Mahabhagavats. In doing so, I want to present an overview of that first transformation. That overview must be comprehensive, but not dependent upon the sordid details of the pus, which triggered, admittedly, that major backlash. That backlash could not be ignored at a certain point, and thus, in due course, the second transformation ensued. There were built-in contradictions in the GBC making this attempt to take on those three deviants, and the GBC was only partially successful in doing so. In other words, the effort to rein in three men who had gone rogue to such an extent that it was becoming obvious to everyone, movement-wide, that effort backfired after initially accomplishing its purposes. It especially backfired with Jayatirtha. He crossed the river and joined the camp of Swami B.R. Sridhar. And, as expected, Swami B.R. Sridhar had voiced strong objection to the air quotes ISKCON governing body taking action against what he considered to be Prabhupada's designated gurus. His objection was based upon the principle that guru cannot be disciplined by non-guru. True, as far as it goes, of course. However, it was not applicable to any of what was going down in the early 80s relative to GBC disciplinary action. The gurus were all bogus gurus. The vitiated GBC was just as bogus because it initially gave them its imprimatur in setting the whole thing up, including dividing the world into 11 playgrounds for its enjoying princes. The world was being flooded with bogus Vaishnav gurus and their improperly initiated disciples by the early 80s. Scandals became, slowly and surely, known to an ever-increasing number of the congregation. Reform thus entered the picture, but reform actually had no place in meaningful rectification. Only a major overhaul, a revolution entailing a return to square one, could have any meaning. The devotees at large did not recognize this fact, and the saga continued unabated, although a cry for change was in the air. A big part of that was a major change in attitude relative to Swami B.R. Sridhar. The GBC finally decided that he was the root cause of their problems in their movement. He was supposedly an elderly, laid-back well-wisher who gave advice and direction in 1978, but now the scheme that he assisted in creating, although please note, the vitiated GBC was itself responsible directly for its creation. That scheme was falling apart. I am not going to say that the leaders of so-called ISKCON were justified in deciding to make Swami B.R. Sridhar its scapegoat. That may have been their intention, but such a ploy was never going to work. They went all in with him, please remember, and thus they are all fully responsible for what went down after they did so. The whole debacle was an institutional delusion, with the vitiated GBC as a body primarily responsible for the initial transformation. Swami B.R. Sridhar contributed to it, that's all. E&E then mentions how so-called ISKCON decided to scapegoat the Swami. The following excerpt is found on page 173 of the Kindled edition of E&E. Quote, "The GBC condemned B.R. Sridhar Maharaj for meddling in ISKCON's affairs. Puranjan Das recalled, quote, In 1982 especially, Satsvarup, Tamal Krishna, Jayapataka, Bhavananda, Kirtanananda, Hare Kṛṣṇa Swamis, and other prominent GBCs all began to denounce Sridhar Maharaj as a dangerous, unauthorized, even insidious deviant. Bhavananda Swami, for example, began to openly lecture, quote, "It is better to eat hamburgers than to listen to Sridhar Maharaj," unquote. Kirtanananda Swami, Jayapataka Swami, and other GBCs even visited Sridhar in Mayapur and insulted him viciously. Then a huge, practically unanimous GBC chorus began howling, quote, "Śrīla Prabhupāda never trusted Sridhar Maharaj, he is poison," and so on, unquote. We should note that this sudden accusation came from the very same people who had gone to B.R. Sridhar Maharaj to get their new guruship certified in 1978, claiming then that he was a trusted authority, etc., unquote. Tattvamasi. One major contradiction was thus revealed, and word of it spread. The great schism between so-called ISKCON and Gaudiya Math was its resultant. These superficial causes produced another contradiction. What was the status of those initiated by gurus who were excommunicated, that was Jayatirtha, or as in the case of both Hangsadutta and TKG, gurus who were suspended and had their zones taken away from them? Were there new people who they initiated in ceremonies still initiated? Could someone initiated by a former institutional guru, who was then suspended or rejected by the vitiated GBC, could he still remain in ISKCON, that new initiate, so-called ISKCON? Could he still be considered viable for Brahminical activity in the cult? Relying upon an obscure comment from a recent Bengali law, a solution the vitiated GBC came up with was implemented. It became known as reinitiation. There was a rationalization which preceded it, but that card from the bottom of the air quotes ISKCON deck was not pulled out, except in one case that I know. The rationalization was that any and all initiations performed by its approved gurus, post-Prabhupada, were only legitimate due to so-called ISKCON itself, not due to the status of its recognized gurus. All such newcomers were thus allegedly initiated by so-called ISKCON, not by the guru. Their link to the Guru Parampara was established by so-called ISKCON, not by any of its agents or rent-acharyas in the form of ecclesiastical gurus. Despite the high-flying era of the great pretenders, this hidden and underlying factor of institutional control now reared up from its subterranean influence. It had always been there. It had never went away. It was suppressed by the narcissism, egregious narcissism, of Ocean's 11. But some of them were becoming degraded by egregious fall downs, and that triggered its reemergence. This idea that the newcomers were initiated by so-called ISKCON, combined with so-called reinitiation, was nothing more than time-serving damage control. It had not been previously preached. It had not even been mentioned. It was not part of the guru-disciple contract in so-called ISKCON. It was never spoken about, what to speak of explained, by any of the gurus who performed initiating ceremonies in so-called ISKCON post-Prabhupada. It was unprecedented. It had no basis except for one remote quote by a relatively unknown Bengali Pandit. E&E quoted your host speaker in connection to my view of reinitiation. Quote, eventually, ISKCON leaders recognized the dangers inherent in reinitiation, and some concluded that the disciples of fallen gurus were still connected to the Sampradaya because they were linked to the Parampara by ISKCON. Kailasa Chandra explained, quote, some kind of better adjustment had to be made. Otherwise, most of these newcomers would leave and or join the Neo-Gaudiya Math. At least one commissioner began to advocate that these newcomers were still linked to the Parampara, even if their Diksha Guru was no longer considered bona fide by the cult. The rationale for this was that they were initially linked to the Parampara through ISKCON and not through their guru. Taking this concoction one obvious step further, since it was and remains an undisputed fact that so-called ISKCON was controlled by the governing body, the sanction of the governing body in the form of its approval of its initiation process confirmed that these newly initiated devotees were initially connected to the Sampradaya by the sanction of the process itself. This, of course, would also mean that any neophyte devotee could give initiation if he was recognized by the GBC to do so, since the sanction, quote unquote, the sanction of the process itself would be sufficient, unquote. As has already been mentioned, unlike Jayatirtha, Hangsadutta and TKG were only suspended. They could no longer initiate. Their zones were taken over by other, air quotes, ISKCON leaders. They were called, quote unquote, spiritually sick. In order to placate their disciples, they were sent into limbo. This was anathema to both of them, Hangsadutta and TKG. But they had engaged in utterly unacceptable behavior which triggered this reaction. Swami B.R. Sridhar did not approve of the governing body disciplining what he considered to be Prabhupada's selected men for spiritual master. However, like almost everybody else, he did not know that they were never selected as guru by Prabhupada. They were only appointed as ritviks. Unlike almost everyone else, however, TKG and Hangsadutta knew the fact. They knew the truth of the situation. They thus had a potent trump card to play. They were in a position to upend the whole, air quotes, ISKCON apple cart and invalidate all of the post-1977 initiations and the so-called gurus who performed them in one fell swoop. TKG, with Hangsadutta present and having introduced him to the assembly, decided to play that trump card. This went down at what was known as the Pyramid House talks in the first week of December 1980. Now, it turned out to be a negotiating tactic, but the other devotees at that assembly did not know that it would be only used as leverage. Basically, it forced the vitiated GBC to readmit those two suspended gurus to the spiritual master fold, because here is what TKG revealed that night. Quote, TKG actually said, Prabhupada never appointed any gurus. Tamal Krishna explained, actually, Prabhupada never appointed any gurus. He didn't appoint 11 gurus. He appointed 11 ritviks. He never appointed them gurus. Myself and the other GBC have done the greatest disservice to this movement the last 3 years because we interpreted the appointment of ritviks as the appointment of gurus. What actually happened, I'll explain. I explained it, but the interpretation is wrong. What actually happened was that Prabhupada mentioned that he might be appointing some ritviks. So the GBC met for various reasons, and they went to Prabhupada, 5 or 6 of us. It was 6, actually. We asked him, Śrīla Prabhupāda, after your departure, if we accept disciples, whose disciples will they be? Your disciples or mine? Later on, there was a piled-up list for people to get initiated, and it was jammed up. I said, Śrīla Prabhupāda, you once mentioned about ritviks. I don't know what to do. We don't want to approach you, but there's hundreds of devotees named, and I'm just holding all the letters. I don't know what you want to do. So Prabhupada said, all right, I will appoint so many. And he started to name them, and he did name them. He made it very clear that they are his disciples. At that point, it was very clear in my mind that they were his disciples. Later on, I asked him, Śrīla Prabhupāda, is this all, or do you want to add more? He said, as is necessary, others may be added. So now I understand that what he did was very clear. He was physically incapable of performing the function of initiation physically. Therefore, he appointed officiating priests to initiate on his behalf. He appointed 11, and he said very clearly, whoever is nearest, he can initiate. This is a very important point, because when it comes to initiating, it isn't whoever is nearest. It's whoever your heart goes, who you repose your faith on. You take initiation from him. But when it's officiating, it's whoever is nearest. And he was very clear. He named them. They were spread out all over the world. And he said, whoever you're nearest, you just approach that person and they'll check you out. Then on my behalf, they'll initiate, unquote. Yeah, it was a breath of fresh air. But this was in the early 80s. No internet. The means to spread ideas was position papers via copy machines or slow-moving word of mouth. Those 2 men and other leaders on the commish knew that they could cover this revelation up before it reached any kind of critical mass. As could only have been predicted, the 2 gurus had their suspensions immediately reversed. They returned to their zones, re-engaged with their disciples, so-called initiated disciples, and everything got covered over again, just like it was previous to the Topanga Canyon talks at Pyramid House. As expected, TKG then sang a different tune. Hardly anyone in the movement knew of these machinations, and for those who did, they acquiesced to the GBC and their leaders. Things were breaking down, but the center still needed to hold. That center now switched from the 11 great pretenders to the vitiated GBC. The commish issued a position paper, which apparently explained everything. It was not the real explanation, however. It was only damage control. Chapter 9 closes by quoting this, air quotes, ISKCON propaganda. Quote, it is the duty of ISKCON's initiating gurus to sit on their vyasasans and defeat the ignorance of the age by their strong preaching. Some of our men may have difficulties, but their problems are due to their having lost sight of Krishna for the moment, not due to sitting on a vyasasan. Arjuna also wanted to step down from his chariot and abandon the fight, but Krishna condemned this as a great mistake. Similarly, it will be a great mistake if our initiating gurus step down from their vyasasans. Rather, let them preach boldly by the side of Krishna as Arjuna fought boldly to crush the demoniac forces. So let us accept these failures and setbacks as pillars of success, unquote. Despite the GBC paper, which attempted to rationalize the fall downs of the so-called Uttama Adhikari gurus, more and more ISKCON members became disillusioned. Unquote. Chapter 9 is a very long chapter. Your host speaker made a determination as to its essence, which is not immediately self-evident. We have already indicated this decision earlier, so now let us proceed to that essence, which entails comprehending how and especially why the Zonal Acharya scam collapsed much more quickly than it should have. The Hare Kṛṣṇa movement, in terms of an international organization, is neither a democracy nor a republic, nor is it an oligarchy or a tyranny. Although once deviated, it can degrade into that. It is not totalitarian, but to the unschooled eye, it may appear to be so. It is not a monarchy, but there is an indirect element of monarchy, the transcendental autocrat, in it, although that element is on a higher level than a king, by far. The Hare Kṛṣṇa movement is and must be authoritarian. It is so at all levels. In terms of ISKCON, when it was bona fide, it functioned at the local level via spiritual authoritarianism. It did not, however, function as a communist entity. Prabhupada constantly deprecated communism, and the Hare Kṛṣṇa movement made little, if any, tangible inroads into strictly communist countries. That is an established historical fact. Indeed, in the early 80s, 3 devotees in the Soviet Union were executed simply because they were Hare Kṛṣṇa members. Then we come to the theocratic consideration. This is a touchy subject. The Hare Kṛṣṇa movement can be considered a kind of theocracy. Bogus theocracies are always totalitarian, and the Hare Kṛṣṇa movement can never be any such thing. It is a cultural movement, not an organized religion. It advocates and recognizes the legitimacy of totalism, but it utterly rejects totalitarianism. The absolute truth is totalism. Real theocracy is necessarily authoritarian, but not oppressively so. While it was bona fide, there was a distinct, viable, and authorized chain of command in Prabhupada's branch of the Krishna consciousness movement. That is always wanted, even at the granular level of guru and disciple. Consider this purport, an excerpt from this purport from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, text 30, quote, "The Lord instructs that one has to become fully Krishna conscious to discharge duties as if in military discipline. Such an injunction may make things a little difficult. Nevertheless, duties must be carried out with dependence on Krishna, because that is the constitutional position of the living entity. The living entity cannot be happy independent of the cooperation of the Supreme Lord." Unquote. Accepting orders in the authorized hierarchy of his movement was integral and all-pervading in Prabhupada's arrangement, while it remained bona fide previous to the zonal imposition of the late 70s. As long as all the authorities observe this principle rigidly, as the purport says, as if in military discipline, then everything progressed quite well and nicely. The intrigues and treacheries of Maya could be overcome as long as this injunction was honored. The authoritarianism of his movement had Prabhupada at its capstone and functioned downline from him. Devotees were dependent upon their assigned sevas, which were determined by the orders they received from those in command directly above them. This did not make the movement a military outfit, but from one perspective it shared something with that paradigm. Devotees want authority. They want orders. The orders generally remained bona fide while Prabhupada was still with us. But everything went into the crapper in the spring of 1978. This only became apparent, as in more and more increasingly apparent, when the egregious fall-downs of many comprising Ocean's 11 became common knowledge. It took time. Devotees were much more compulsive than society at large because they functioned according to non-egotistical desires and always wanted to please and follow orders. Acting in that way did not generate karmic reaction because it did not entail making choices based upon self-centered individual desires. They knew they were fallen and not in a position to determine whether or not their services, if individually determined separate from the chain of command, actually were then connected to the Guru Parampara. Once the Zonal Acharya scam surfaced, no seva performed in that movement was connected to the Parampara, including initiations conducted for the egotistical benefit of, air quotes, ISKCON bogus gurus. However, that did not mean that the fan immediately stopped spinning in terms of compulsion. For a short while, everything appeared to be the same to most devotees, your host speaker not included, because to a significant extent, superficially, it was pretty much the same. Ocean's 11 should have been able to exploit this for decades, but they could not. They blew their opportunity to enjoy like Prabhupada, and they were all imitation Prabhupads, because they went way too far. They imitated ostentatiously, and more importantly, they criticized each other and fought among themselves. If you employ higher intelligence, known as pragya, to its analysis, these are the chief and deeper realizations to glean from Chapter 9. These conclusions lie at the base of the fall-downs and what ensued in so-called ISKCON, and those egregious deviations became too much any longer to bear by the rank and file once they became known. This theme will be expanded upon next month because Chapter 10 of ENE continues to describe how the internal breakdown of that pseudo-Krishna apasatharma degraded even further. Expect more on this topic in order to understand the deeper realizations intrinsic to it. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. It is very late in the game if you had not yet realized it as such. An in-depth analysis provided herein for your edification and realization has now been provided. You should have no inclination whatsoever, what to speak of compulsion, to follow any orders, routines, or worship services promulgated by so-called ISKCON, because all of its leaders and gurus are bogus. They have been so for decades. As long as that organized religion is kept from securing political power from behind the curtain, it will continue to be exposed and it will continue to degrade. The tainted preaching of so-called ISKCON will then find its momentum checked, stopped, and reversed. Sadeva Samya.